event is a Crosscut talk. So Crosscuts is a subsection of the talks program. It's really Maddie and my favorite section to program because what we do is we look through the NYFF lineup and find two filmmakers or artists in the lineup who we think would be really fun to have talk to each other. And sometimes those connections that we find through those conversations can be really surprising and enlightening. And today is no exception. Today's Crosscuts talk is the final of our Crosscut series, but frankly, it was one of the first that we settled on. The two filmmakers who will be talking to each other today are Raven Jackson, director of Main Slate Selection All Dirt Road's Taste of Salt, and Annie Baker, director of Main Slate Selection Janet Planet. The films are completely distinctive, different, have their own styles, but they also speak to each other in some really interesting ways. They're both first features made by two incredible women who have a writing practice outside of filmmaking. Annie's a playwright, a very acclaimed playwright. Raven's a wonderful poet. Both films are gorgeous mother-daughter stories that have an incredibly evocative sense of place. And both films depict nature so beautifully and the ways in which it mingles with the way we live our lives. So really, really thrilled to be able to bring these two artists in conversation. And today's conversation will be moderated by Kameron Austin Collins, a critic and a member of the NYFF61 Main Slate Committee. So without further ado, I would like to invite all three guests to the stage. Raven. Annie, and Cam.
Thank you, and thank you all of you for coming. This is really exciting. And before getting into any questions, I just wanted to say to both of you that you had among my favorite films that we programmed this year. And Raven, I saw your film at Sundance and instantly fell in love with it, instantly wanted it for NYFF, and have been thinking about it since January, which is a long time to be, you know. And Annie, we saw your film in June, and it's, again, something that I've been thinking about and contemplating and revisiting in my mind for months. So this is just really an honor and a joy. I wanted to start with maybe an odd question, but it's something that occurred to me over watching your films, and something that immediately that I felt, which is that watching just the opening scenes of both of these films, I felt an innate trust in where these films were going to take me, and also a certainty that I didn't know where they were going to take me. And I wanted to talk a little bit about trust, in part because you both made adventurous films, adventurous projects, films that I think it must have been interesting to talk to actors about in terms of getting them to be in it, producers in terms of getting them to sign on and support them. And I just want both of you to talk a little bit about the seeds of these projects and how you got your collaborators to take the leap with you. Whoever wants to start. We can eeny, meeny, miny, mo. We can do, you know.
I'll start, I guess. Yes, you know, for All Dirt Road's Taste of Salt, and thank you for those beautiful words. I came to it not from just one place, but a lot of places. I knew I wanted to make a film on a Black woman in the South, and I knew I wanted to explore her life. And for the longest time, I used the word nonlinear when saying it, and then I changed the language, but I would say in a nonlinear way. And it took me taking photographs and really building a pitch deck for the film and building my language for it before I really came to the page, to the chagrin of my producer, Maria Altamirano. She wanted those pages at first, but once I was in the world, I started to write what I call portraits, which are scenes of her at different ages. And then I started to write and take away, write and take away. I wrote more than in the script. It's like a 60-page script. And when we would go out and pitch it, when we were still building the project in the earlier stages, I think it was important for us to, once that language was found, to be unapologetic about what it was, and to, when you meet someone and they aren't willing to take that leap or those risks, be like, okay, it's not this one, maybe it's the next one, but not be willing to move just to make this person come on board, And because I knew what the project was deeply, Maria, who was on it at that, already knew what it was. When we did meet folks like Pastel with Adela Romansky, Barry Jenkins, and Mark Sariak, it made sense, it was like, they got it, and it made sense to move forward. But I think us owning it was important.
Yeah, it's so funny that your script was only 60 pages because mine was only 67, but we both made, because your movie is like almost 140, or?
It's 97 minutes.
Yeah, but the minute a page thing doesn't apply to either movie at all.
And I'm curious, did you know you would sit in moments?
Yeah, I knew it would be longer than 67 minutes. I remember when I met my editor, he was like, I think it's going to be 95. We like sort of are placing bets on how long, but I'm curious how long your first cut was too. Our first cut was 2:45. No, do you remember how long yours was?
No, it was too long, but
yeah.
Maybe 2 hours, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, at some point, I would be so curious to hear about what you cut.
Me too.
And to tell you what I cut. But I totally agree. And I do think that producers are so important. And for me, really early on, the very first person I gave the script to was a person named Rose Garnett, who was at BBC Film at the time, but is now at A24, and is just a powerhouse and an incredible person, and wants to make the best film possible and isn't thinking about marketability, or if she's thinking about it, she's not telling you. And so bringing her on at the beginning was really good. She's an old friend. And then I brought on the producer Dan Janvey, and then his new film company, Present Company, came on, and all of these people were just people. It's like they weren't going to try to pressure me to cast a movie star. That was laid on the table very, very early on. And when I was meeting with producers and they were talking that way, I just was kind of like, oh, okay, well, this isn't the right match for this project. And same with all the department heads too. But yeah, it's tricky. It's really tricky with your first film, and also admitting when you have no idea what you're doing and when to ask for help, and then also when to just be like, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I know this one thing, and we just have to chase it. It's a tricky balance. Yeah. And
you're both coming from also just real experience in other art forms, poetry and photography and playwriting. And I was really curious. I mean, I can feel that in both films, but you really sort of moved beyond, I think, your prior work, your prior media. It feels that way to me. Maybe for the both of you, it feels very much in concert with the work you've been doing to this point. I mean, actually, Raven, I know that you had a lot of photography that sort of set up your visual imagination for the film, and poetry as well. But it's interesting, these feel very much for me like fully formed traces of other art forms, everything that you both seem to know, but also as films, just completely cinema, and I'm curious about your relationship to the medium before jumping into this project, and your prior work and how it might have informed.
Yeah, I think for me, my poetry, I studied writing first, specifically poetry, and it's my obsessions are still there, with nature, with the body, with small moments, all of that. And so when I made the leap to studying film, it translates. It feels like all the mediums I explore speak to each other in a way. And so When coming to this project, the photographs for sure, I took photographs of the South and landscapes, members of my family that were in the pitch deck and informed, and again, helped evoke that feeling for me when I was approaching the page. So it didn't feel like a big leap. I think because I had made the leap when I went from poetry to film, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? And so it felt like I was already on the ground. I was just discovering more.
Yeah, well, film was actually, when I was a kid, kind of what I wanted to do when I grew up, and I wanted to be a film director. And then it just seemed really unattainable for a lot of reasons. I remember I thought about applying to film school when I was 17, and it just was, I just remember looking at like the NYU brochure, and they said you had to produce your own movies or something. It just was like, it did seem like it was a thing rich kids did. So I just was, and I think I was also just really intimidated by the idea of directing. The whole thing just seemed impossible. And theater ended up being a thing I fell into a little more accidentally, which I think actually benefited me in a lot of ways. I actually have way more gaps in my theater history knowledge than my film history knowledge. And in some ways, I think it helped me starting out, because I could, sort of going back to the courage thing, just be like, well, I'm going to do this thing, and I don't actually know if anyone's done it before, because I don't know. And with film, I felt actually sort of more burdened by my film nerdiness and anxiety. And sometimes sometimes you have to pay attention to that, and sometimes you have to let go of that. For me, the biggest leap, less of the aesthetic of film, which actually felt like, oh my God, I wanted to do this my whole life, like work in this medium, was more than just like being captain of a giant ship, and being the boss for that many people. It's wild. And when you just watch, now when I watch the end crawl, like you just have a totally different relationship to end crawl forevermore, I think, after directing a movie. And that was really new and exciting and terrifying and transformative. Like I feel like being in charge of an opera, and it was a tiny movie, like in the world of movies, I think it was really small, but it's still a lot of dudes. And it was really amazing. And I feel like a different person now that I did that. Yeah. Yeah, but it was scary.
Can I ask about? I mean, you're saying some things that I'm really interested in part because I think you used the word intimidated, which I kind of can't imagine. I mean, as a critic and as a programmer, I think about film every day, much of the day, but I still can't wrap my mind around how you do it, in particular because you both made such intimate films. I think about, for example, the moment in your film, Annie, of mother and daughter in bed, and I think the daughter's saying, like, I want to take a piece of you. Or the hug that I timed the second time that I watched, because I knew that it would be an impressive number.
What was it?
Well, it was like a minute of hand-holding embrace, and then the embrace is like a central 3 minutes, and then another minute of holding hands. I felt like I needed to break it down a little bit because the full gesture is so key. But you're making such intimate projects, and yet you're the captain of the ship. How do you kind of bring that intimacy of the subject to bear on how you run the ship? How do you establish that on set? How do you make actors feel safe? How do you make everyone feel like they can open up to?
Do you mean like physical intimacy or emotional intimacy?
Both,
or
all of it.
Yeah.
But really, I think mostly emotional.
Like how to create a space where people can feel really vulnerable and like lie in bed together and stare at each other, or hug each other. You mean like create that kind of space for actors and
right.
It's really hard. I feel like one thing I was actually really worried about that, and then actually once I got to set, I realized like, oh my God, talking to actors is actually like the thing I've done for 13 years. And I learned the hard way. I wasn't a natural at it when in my late 20s. Like, I was a very result-oriented, like, do it this way person. And I really had to learn how to talk to actors and make them feel free and open and loose. And I was so glad for all that, like, hard theater rehearsal room meltdown experience when I was on set. And I looking back, I actually, I made so many mistakes, but I actually think I took good care of my actors. Yeah, I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, and I love the scene from your film that was mentioned because I adore that scene with them both in the bed. But yeah, for me, I'm really big on being intentional about protecting the space around the actors and like not having as little people around as possible when we're shooting, and Video Village as far away as possible. Even though people tend to, group around the AC monitor. Because with the film, often I'm asking the actors to go to intimate spaces or to be available for inspiration, but it's also for me, I don't want to hear about what's for lunch when we're trying to go somewhere, important. And so I think for me, that's a big thing I do, is really try to have as little noise around as possible so people can really be in it, and I'm really intentional about that.
I'm wondering, because you both talked about the longer cuts, which I'm kind of so curious about. 2 hours and 40 minutes. It's a lot. Yeah. That's like Casino. It's like, it's almost Titanic, That's a lot. That's how I think of these things. But in part because I'm so impressed in both of these projects by how much is left unsaid, and by the tempo of each, the space, the amount of, the crickets in both, the sounds, the rain, the things that you. It's like both of you found ways to sort of strip the films down to the essentials, but it's still so evocative. And I'm curious about the path from the page. I know that, Raven, you had multiple drafts, and I think you mentioned in your Sundance interview, sort of stripping it down in the writing process, and then I guess further in the cut, and then the 2 hour and 40 minute version of your film. Almost can't imagine what else would be there, because everything seems to be in place. So I'm curious about what you took away, how you distilled the project.
For me, it was really listening to what the film wanted. I knew going into production that just because it's on the script, it doesn't mean it's going to be like once we shoot. That doesn't mean it's going to be exactly the script. It's a very modular script. It's scenes at different ages. I knew once I get into the edit, it could be asking to be ordered differently. And so I was already open to that going into the edit. But yeah, emotionally, there are some scenes where there's a lot of, I say slant rhymes often, a lot of slant rhymes in the film. And sometimes it's like, it doesn't need that extra beat, even though I love it, it's beautiful, but it doesn't need that. Or it doesn't need this moment with this character, feels like, why are we with this character? You know what I mean? Things like that. And so really taking the time to sit with the cut and to return to it. I need space too, to like really take in the cut at times. And it would be just listening to, okay, this feels repetitive here, or it just feels like we already have this beat. And there are just several scenes I love, but it just wasn't needed anymore, where it worked in the script. It felt as beautiful as it was. It felt like it was taking away rather than adding in a way.
Yeah, it was amazing how intuitive it actually ends up being, and how it does feel like the film like spits out as some weird animal that just like chews up and spits out scenes that you thought were really good. But when you watch your cut, just like somehow it just feels like the film's rejecting them. And so that happened to me with a lot of the material. And to be clear, our first cut was like, it wasn't one I was pleased with. We spent months putting it together, and then I remember the day before Thanksgiving, we watched it. And it was like the most devastating it was completely devastating, and I felt like I was going to throw up. I thought I was going to cry. Like, I really was like, yeah, just watching something that didn't work on that massive, and I was just, yeah, I was wrecked. And my editor said something like, Scorsese says if you don't puke after watching your first cut, you're not a real filmmaker. some thing like that. But it actually made me feel better, because I really, like, on a physical level was like, this is wrong. I thought I knew what I was doing, and this is all wrong. But it was a kind of incredible experience, because that cut was everything we had shot. It was kind of an assembly. Like, it was everything we had shot, and doing our absolute best trying to, because my script was pretty, like, I tend to rewrite as I go, and I thought I had a pretty solid 67-page script. So it was pretty wild to find out it was over 2.5 hours, and that it didn't work. So, and then the process from that point on, it was like super intuitive. You're just like, oh, I don't want to watch this right now. Like, in isolation, this works, but somehow, watching the dailies, I loved this, but somehow in the context of the movie, it's like unbearable. And my editor, who was wonderful, and I had a really funny dynamic where he was like, you're sort of playing the editor role and I'm playing the filmmaker role. I was quite ruthless, and he would like be a little more protective of stuff, which was interesting. Yeah, but I found it like on a physical level, you could just kind of be like, that feels bad, we have to get rid of it. And it's heartbreaking, because it was like a major plot point.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm curious, when you watched the assembly, because I had the same feeling when I watched the assembly, was like, oh my God. And I'm curious for you, what you did to build that trust back in what you did on set, back in yourself, back in the film. You know what I mean?
Did you, like, the assembly, like, after?
When the first thing I watched, after it was like a month after we shot.
Yeah.
And it was straight with the script. And when I watched it, I had the feeling of the same thing you described of, oof, you know what I mean? Like, this is a little bit of panic, a lot of panic.
Yeah.
But then for me, my process for building my trust back in, the process what the film myself was like, watching the scenes that I was most excited about, and focusing on those first, and then building off of that. And I'm curious if you had something that was your re-entry into the film after that.
God, that's such a good question. Yeah, because I never watched. My editor was like, "Don't watch the assembly; you'll want to die." So I didn't. But then I had that experience like 2 months later when I watched like the first cut that we had made. It was so tough. I barely remember. I think the thing that was reassuring was a thing you just don't get in theater, which was like, oh, we can just be really radical and then put it back. Like, I just started kind of radically cutting stuff and making like really big moves, and then knowing we had all the footage and we could just put it back, and that what was called for was like huge radical edits, and that was like what this film was presenting me with. And it, you know, that but man, I still feel upset about it. Like, I'm still building trust back up. Yeah, but it was, I feel like those 7 to 8 months editing were my film school. And I feel like I will approach things completely differently now. Yeah, and then, but it was thrilling. I don't know if you had this experience, like feeling really bad, getting really low. And then I remember coming in with some sort of crazy cuts, like really huge cuts, and my editor saying, like, I don't know if that's gonna work. That's too big, it'll hurt the story. And then us kind of like feeling like cutting off the film's arm, and then kind of watching it and being like, oh my God, it's better. You know, that feeling of like, we are making it better. We aren't making these cuts because we're pandering or because someone's telling us to. We're making these cuts because like, we know it needs to get better. Yeah.
Something I'm curious about that's related to this, but that stands out to me about both of these films, particularly rewatching them recently, is I'm kind of obsessed with the way that you both put your finger on the mysteries of the adults in our lives when we're children. And this kind of relates to the editing question in part because I I was sort of curious about that being something that was distilled, like clarifying the relationships in the edit, but also as you're making it, but also just broadly. And it's a kind of slippery kind of question to ask, I guess, but the way that both of your films reminded me of the things that I did not know about my parents or didn't understand about my parents or adults, the people that they were dating, or whatever it is, the things that I didn't realize could be true about my parents until I was older, the things that I didn't know. Your films both feel so informed by the mystery of that, but also the joy of those connections in the midst of the relationships, in particular like mothers and daughters, but also fathers and father figures, or the kind of the momentary maybe stepsister that we get early on, her friend that I really kind of so sad for her, frankly, but just this is something that I just it's barely a question, but it's something that your films both make me think about, is just what we don't know about the most important people in our lives as we're adolescents, and the ways that affects our childhoods, but that we don't quite understand yet. I don't know how to turn that into like more of a question, but it's just something that your films are really made me think about. In particular, I'm thinking of the mother in your film and the complicated things that she is trying to understand about herself, that a daughter might not understand that a mother is trying to understand, but also that as an adult you don't know about yourself even. Just making a film about that is really interesting to me. Making a film about the kind of transience of parents, be it death or not being around. I'm thinking of when a father comes back and we see a shadow appear on the JFK and MLK portraits, but he's sort of disembodied. These moments that really just, I feel like I sit up in my seat and I'm thinking about everything that our parents don't reveal to us about themselves, and how you turn that into narrative art, even nonlinear, is fascinating to me. And I would love to just kind of pick your brains a little bit about that theme and your approach to it. You're interested
so much in your film. When you were talking, I was just thinking of this scene where the mom is dancing and she's just like, she looks so exquisitely beautiful and it's so sensuous, and it's like the daughter, it's like, it is that like daughter watching mother as like the most beautiful person in the world, and then the mother like, she like touches her foot, and then the mother's like, she says something like, don't speak unless you're spoken to. And it's that, I loved that sequence so much, and that moment where your mother is like a goddess and then can like just with like one little sentence kind of just like cut your head off. And I thought that was so special, and I feel like that's sort of what you're talking about, the like incredible power your parents have and how well you know them, and how well, and you don't know them at all, and the tension of that mystery. I don't have an answer to any of it, but I did keep thinking about that sequence after I watched it in your movie.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that one, because that's when you were speaking about your question, that's the one that came to mind for me too, and thinking of the mysteries of, because it was when I was directing Sheila in that scene, it was like I was thinking of myself as a child. And it came to like, that scene reminds me a lot of myself as a child, like in being in those spaces, but also feeling a little uninvited, you know? It's like, it's a grown folks time, you know what I mean? And so that line for me is very important to speak to that, because she's there and she's watching and the joy of it all, but also like to the mysteries of adulthood. Like the mother is playing a game, you know, she's with, they're saying things that they don't necessarily want a child to hear, you know what I mean? And so that was a scene that came to mind to me too, because she's still outside of it as much as she is there, you know?
Were you interested in making films? I kind of hate the phrase coming of age, but broadly it applies. Were you interested in making films about adolescence in that way? Were you interested in, because I think the adult perspective is actually very, very important to what both of you are
My
doing.
follow-up question is, does it annoy you when people say it's a coming of age story, or that it's a mother-daughter story? Because those are both like true of my movie, and then it is also like it is, and I'm sure every filmmaker feels this way, but it is hard when you are trying to make something that's also about like nature and aesthetics and philosophy and all these other things, and then someone's like, it's a mother-daughter story, and you're like, oh man, I guess it is. But that was like kind of like number 10 on my list of things I was thinking about. Yeah.
No, I'm in the same boat. Yeah, it's for sure an aspect of it, and it's there. It's a thread, but it's not. I don't feel Audit Roads is a coming of age film. It is an aspect of it, but it's more. It's like. So I'm in the same boat.
Yeah, and just I have nothing else to say. but it is, but there is the moment where you're like, I guess it's a fucking coming of age story, isn't it? Like, I just have to be okay with it. And there's a lot of
You don't have to be okay
There's
with
a lot
it.
of you don't want to be like, no, it's not, or like, but yeah.
But you did both make films about nature, and I think maybe because of the cult aspect of the amorphous, that commune, I think in my mind, that's California. I was actually surprised that it was the Northeast, because I'm so New Jersey that if I see cult, I think Manson, I think California. But it's more interesting to me, actually, that it's Massachusetts and that we're.
It's just a puppet theater where they all live together. But I guess, it's a little bit.
But the mother does sort of.
Yeah.
They're talking about it, and she says, what is a cult? And it's a difficult, weird question.
Totally.
She doesn't understand if that's even what it is.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that she doesn't quite know. But you made films about nature and place. The rain in your film is really remarkable. It's something that I feel like I kept hearing after the film was over. And the house that your film is set in and the surroundings, it just sort of, it is key to how I remember your film when I'm thinking about it. That house is like remarkable.
Yeah, did you shoot exactly where you grew up?
No, I grew up in Tennessee. I shot in Mississippi,
Oh,
which
got
is
it.
where my mom is from.
I shot like exactly where I grew up, and to find that house, I joined nextdoor.com and pretended to be my mom, and I looked for a really long time because I really wanted to find the right place. How did you find like the place that you settled on in Mississippi?
Location scouting, and I love just driving around. With Maria and I, we drove around just looking for places, and there was the house we used for their main home was nearby. So I saw a house for the house burning on fire scene that was already. It already had a roof fire. Like it was. It had a roof fire.
I wondered
happen there.
about that. How you did that?
And it had a sign, I think, for sale or something. And we called. They were down for us to put some propane bars in there, and we did VFX too. So it was like a mix of both. But nearby, there were other houses we used on set, and because we said, okay, this could be a pocket of the neighborhood that we use for the film, and everyone was open to that. And some of the folks are in the film as background actors, and like the owners of the house that actually had the fire are like in the scene of the house on fire. And so that was how we found it, just location scouting and driving around and getting lost and seeing what's possible.
But you knew you were going to shoot in Mississippi where your mom grew up.
No, I thought at first I was shooting in Tennessee because
wow.
I grew up fishing on the Cumberland River, and I wanted to shoot there. I really did. But then I found Rose Hill Church through, that's in Mississippi, it's in Vicksburg, Mississippi. I found it through Bill Ferris's photographs. And the church, the photographs were from the early 70s. So I was like, there's no way this church is still standing, but I'm going to send this cold email anyway. And I sent it to Bill, and it was still standing.
Oh, that's
and
so
he was
cool.
so down for us to shoot there. And the church has so much rich history, like in the scene, the wedding scene. The song that's playing is from Mary and Amanda Gordon, who were pillars of the church when it was still in operation, and they're in those photographs from the 70s.
Wow.
And you know, their song is in the trailer. And so it was a beautiful gift in that way, in that I'm shooting where my mom is from, and the film does so much with like what's passed from generation to generation. We shot the grocery store scene is in my mom's hometown, Crystal Springs, and it's like it's very close to where she grew up. You know, it's like it was a beautiful conversation.
Yeah, that's so cool.
I'm curious, the women whose faces that we see in the church, were they from the community?
Some were, and some were people in my life.
They're amazing faces. And I loved the way that we kind of step into that scene by looking at them in succession, and then we kind of greet the wedding visually.
Right. And there's some people who just live in the area, and some people who were a part of Rose Hill Church, or who had members of their family who were when it was still in operation. But yeah, I wanted to do those portraits before we see the reveal.
Do we have time for questions from the audience? Okay. Does anyone have questions? I think someone's running you a mic, maybe.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Amy. So nice to meet you both, and thank you for sharing so much about your process. Given that you're a poet and you're a playwright, I'd love to hear about your process of script writing, and I'm curious if your poetic practice and your playwriting practice made its way into the script. Like, what does your film script actually look like?
I had written screenplays for many years to support myself before I wrote this screenplay, but I had a really negative relationship to Final Draft, which I just think is awful for so many reasons. And my script was like finally entered into Final Draft, but I think it's a really intimidating and also like smothering program. And I'm so glad you feel that way too.
Everyone
nodding
complains about it,
vigorously.
yes.
And I think I had a thing. I never write my plays like. I always write my plays just kind of as floating, fragmented dialogue in a Word document for a really long time before I like format it with character names. Because I actually think even just the time it takes to like press return and enter character names can like detract from your flow. And part of the revelation of starting Dry Janet Planet was just like, okay, what if I try to do this? Like, what if I try to approach this as like low stakes and sideways as possible, the way I do with my plays when I'm just taking notes for years, instead of sitting down and being like, I'm going to write a screenplay. That was really helpful for me. And then also writing for myself to direct. I'd always written screenplays like for hire for other people to direct, and there's a kind of like clarity and punchiness that I think is just like demanded, or you think is demanded as a screenwriter. And so I was always kind of writing for someone else. And there was a moment where I was like, okay, I'm just gonna open a Word document. I'm just gonna not enter character names or setting or anything, and I'm just gonna kind of riff. And it's not for anybody to see but me. Nobody will ever look at this but me. And if anything ever comes of it, I'll be the one to direct it. And I think that freed me up a lot. I'm really curious what your process was like.
Yeah, for this one, it started off, I just really didn't know what the shape was going to look like. I had to find it. And so at first, with the different ages, I would for the portraits, I would have a Roman numeral 7, and then write a little bit, and then another Roman numeral, and then it just didn't flow, you know. And it was helpful to have a few people read it, and I got the recommendation that why not just use the slug lines to aid in delineating the different ages rather than adding another page, and I was just using those pages for extra page length anyway. I was just, yeah, if I'm being honest. And so when I did that, it really made it more fluid. And in the slug line, I bold what age she is to like ground the reader, and I have a little paragraph at the beginning of the script or towards the beginning of how to read it that, you know, the age is found in the slug line. But other than that, it's a pretty straightforward script, but it's very spare. I think it's very spare. I think that's where my poetry comes in too, and that I'm very intentional with certain images in certain places. But yeah, it was a process of finding how to make the fluid quality I'm looking for in the film be mirrored in the script.
I guess I'm curious, both of you as writers, how do you go about keeping yourself accountable to like writing and completing the writing process? So I'm asking at something I really am quite crappy with. So I guess, yeah, I'm asking how you both go about doing that.
Good question.
My students ask me that. I teach too, which is how I don't find myself accountable. It's like my excuse to not be accountable to the writing process. I found it really liberating at a certain point to just realize I'm not the kind of person who writes every day. I'm not the kind of person who even writes every week. I don't have a schedule. I don't stick to it. It's just not who I am, and I'm so envious and in awe of the people who do. But I realized that was making me feel bad about myself for so long. Like I really thought I wasn't a real writer because I just like wrote sporadically. And also because the people in my life, I have a kid now, which just like explodes everything schedule-wise. But even before that, I'm just a person who like loves to spend time with my friends and loves to, just isn't a like, sorry, I'm writing, I can't see you kind of person. And again, I thought that meant I wasn't a real writer because relationships were so important to me. And yeah, it's just not true. So I think I just say follow pleasure. And then it's so great. You're like, oh, I do want to write. Like once I'm not worried about the fact that I'm not writing enough, I can actually feel the urge to write. And then I just do it when I want to do it. Yeah, that makes it sound easy and it's awful, but it was really big for me. It was really big for me, like letting go of a like responsible person's writing schedule, and having a job and teaching really helps with that. I mean, you have to have another source of income, and for me that was like everything. Like knowing that my survival was not based on me finishing a draft in time. Super, super important. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I don't think it's necessarily the healthiest thing, but I work really well under pressure. And so it would be like how to get that sense of, sometimes if I have too much time, it's like, I wouldn't bring it out into the page. And so I applied to like writing residencies and would use that application deadline or something to like, earlier on in the development of it to like get me to get out some pages if it has a page deadline that I haven't, when I hadn't written a lot of pages yet. And then when I was in more advanced stages, it would be using producers or friends to say, I'm gonna get you a draft here, or even with myself. Like I really had to find ways for myself to get that sense of, okay, you have until now, Raven. And I think we all have to know what works best for us. But for me, just that sense of working towards something, like I need that pressure, yeah.
Those are really refreshing answers. Just because we live in, you always see those Paris Review, like on Instagram, they'll excerpt the one part of the interview where the writer's like, I wake up at 6 a.m. I have a very nice breakfast, and then I write from this hour to this hour, and then I watch base. It's just like terrible.
And also, it's like it's always like a guy with a wife.
Yes. I was literally in my head imitating someone in particular for whom that is
Like a
very,
wife
very,
who's, like,
very
bringing
true.
him lunch and stuff.
Bringing him tea and yes, reading his drafts and. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Well, yes. Thank you for the talk. It's like been really illuminating. Annie, I'm much more familiar with your work. I've lived with your plays for many years, and I saw your film the other day. I thought it was brilliant, and I was thinking back and like comparing it to your plays. And one thing that I was really curious about this difference between theater and film for you is how you deal with negative space and absence, and how in your plays you are very good at using like offstage as this like element of like this looming sort of like void, and then on stage what the audience, all we have to go off of, you know, is this sort of like liminal zone. And I was wondering how you dealt with that when transitioning to film, because I noticed like you often had like characters positioned like right on the edge of the frame in the film. And I was wondering if that was something you were trying to like carry over, and if there were other like formal elements you found yourself carrying over or discarding when you moved to film.
Yeah, thank you. That's so thoughtful, and I'm having the feeling where like the person you're talking to like understands your work better than you do. So I'm not going to sound smarter than you just did right now. But also what you said feels really true, and like I really appreciate it. And I actually felt that way about your film too, that there's so much emotion happening outside the frame, and so much action happening outside the frame. For me, it's a very intuitive thing. It's not like a decision I'm making. And actually, I feel when it has been an intellectual decision, it usually doesn't work as well as when just like intuitively, I feel like we don't need to see the thing right now. I'm trying to think of a good example in my movie or your movie, but do you know what I mean? And some of it was my DP too. Like my DP is like a very, has a very kind of like slippery spiritual way of shooting stuff, and very intuitive. She's not like she's a very like unconventional, intuitive cinematographer. And so sometimes it was also honestly just like the weird framing she chose that I was like, that's great. Yeah.
Because that was a question just as a follow-up.
Yeah.
That was a question I had, because there was some moments where there was like a hand lingering, or, you know, and I was like, ooh, I wonder how planned this is, or was it found? You know what I mean? Like, I was curious, and then when you mentioned the cinematographer, I was curious, what that how much y'all lean towards like finding, or like a shot listing, or knowing what you were going to end on. Because there were some moments I was really struck by what the final, like whether it's the hand closing the door, or there was one, I can't exactly remember what the scene was. It might be when they were in the bed.
Yeah, and the mom's hand is on the sheets. Yeah, well, and I have the same question for you after, but I think that's an example of like the hand on the door is like super planned, and we shot listed it, and we had to figure out how we were going to cut it, because it's actually sort of like, you can't tell because it's in blackness, but it's like cutting back and forth quite quickly, and then on the hand. So we were like very careful about this. Like I thought about a lot of like Bresson movies while I was shot listing. It was like, that was very like intellectual, the shot listing behind that sequence. And then Janet's hand on the sheets when she sits up and hears like her boyfriend outside, that was something that happened just in the rush of shooting it. And then I was like, I love that so much. And it felt like it was in dialogue with what had happened before. And then we had Julianne do it over and over again. And I feel like that's the amazing thing about film. Like certain things are super planned, and then something you like even more is a complete accident, and how to have enough time to be open to that, or not have enough time but still let it happen. What was your shot listing process like with your DP?
We shot listed for sure, but to your point about being open, like being open to what's actually happening before us. And when you mentioned like the hands being in conversation, Jomo and I would say slant rhymes, and like the hands and how the embraces, how are they speaking to each other, and showing like how these relationships have changed or evolved. And so, yeah, we knew what we were going for, but we were open. Mm-hmm.
You linger on hands in a way that really made me think about like the physical texture of hands, like age, like the grandmother's hand in particular is like a beautiful hand, and the way that you linger on it. You construct entire scenes, it feels like, out of those parts of the body, but hands in particular feel very, very deliberate. And was that something you were sort of, that was in your shot listing, or was that something where you are kind of figuring out what the emotional contours of a scene are, and you're saying, this is what makes sense, this is all we need to do?
Yeah, some of it, the scene on the couch with the clay dirt and it's all hands, that's in the script. There are moments where I've scripted that hands are going to be at play, but it rose, like when we started to shot listing, it rose, but then when we were on set, it rose even more. Like even like Kaylee in the first scene when she digs into the dirt at the river, I realized then, I hadn't scripted that. You know what I mean? I was like, oh, this is gonna be a rhyme, And so it was knowing just who I am. Hands are up there with eyes for me, and they say so much I love hands. And so I knew they were gonna have play, but it was a discovery how much they played.
I think we're almost out of time. We have one more question. Yeah, in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for this. It was really inspiring. My first question is for Raven. I was really struck by the privacy you afforded your characters and how paradoxically, experientially, that made me feel more linked to their interiority. And so I was wondering how you came upon that visual language or approach. And then for both of you, I was wondering what's the momentum that drives you through the course of a project? I'm sure it changes throughout the various stages, but I was wondering kind of what keeps your fire lit?
Yeah, to the question about privacy, what comes to mind, sound is coming to mind when you say that, and how I wanted to be intentional about using the sound design of the film to get into a deeper, hopefully, level of interiority with these characters. And I think of, with your question, the moment of Mac lying on the ground and you just hear the nature around her. It's like those moments where there's quiet, but there's so much happening, and how sound could speak to that, and so much happening not just in the world, but inside of this character, even in this moment of quiet, So yeah, I thought about that a lot, and that's what's coming up with your question.
And the second question was, what keeps your fire lit? Which I love that phrase, by the way.
I was really worried about that because people told me how hard it was going to be, and I remember my producer said, it's going to feel like the whole process is designed to kill you, and he was totally right. And I had a 2-year-old when I was prepping the movie and a 3-year-old when I was shooting it, and now she's 4, and yeah, this is like such a dumb thing to quote. It's an amazing book, but there's like, my childhood favorite book was The Phantom Toll Booth. And at the end of the Phantom Toll Booth, they've like done the whole quest or whatever, and then the like king has a secret or something. Anyway, but the secret is like what you just did was impossible, but they only know at the end that it was impossible. And I feel I could cry talking. I feel like that's how I feel about this movie. Like I couldn't do that again. It absolutely destroyed me. And also I had endless, and I don't know, like the second we finished like the final DCP review, which was honestly like only like a month ago, I slept for like 5 days straight. And I realized that for 2.5 years, I'd like been on a kind of like cocaine that my brain was manufacturing for itself. And I was so, but it's beautiful. Like I was so energized and I was so crazy and I was so on fire and I didn't forget anything and I didn't drop any balls and I can't believe it. And I don't know if it's just like pure fear and panic or love of the form or what, but it's almost like just even a month later, I don't quite understand how it all happened and how I operated on so little sleep for so long. How do you feel about it?
Speaking of so little sleep, I remember being on set. I wouldn't even need to set the alarm. I would just wake up in a panic.
Yes, totally. I would wake up like at 4 a.m. even if we didn't have to be there till 8.
I know,
yeah.
and it's like, and I'm a deep sleeper, but it got to a point where I literally would just wake. I would not need to set an alarm, and not the healthiest thing. You know, that's a hard one. I think for me, because the days are hard. They can be hard, and it's beautiful, but hard too, especially when you're shooting a lot outside, you know. But I think it's, during production is having good people around you, and like, of course, caring about what you're making, you know what I mean? And when the days are hard or when something falls out, like, reminding yourself of why you're doing this. And for me, my pitch deck was a good reminder of that, or looking at inspirations. I made an inspirations deck with like photographs of my grandma's photo album, and looking at things like that really would be like, okay, I know why I'm doing this.
Well, totally, and it was so brutal that I was like, how do directors who didn't write this, like who don't feel super close to the material do this? Like I actually couldn't, I was like, this is so my movie, I wrote it, I'm one of the producers, like it was so close to me and it was still so brutal, and I was kind of blown away by the idea of like, what if I was just some like gun for hire who was like directing a screenplay I didn't even like that much? I mean, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So I felt very, very thankful that my first movie was something that was so dear and close to me and involved people I loved, and shooting in places that were important to me with extras who are people I know who are important to me. That did make it, and the really dark moments feel worth it. Yeah.
I think that's a great place to close. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you.